Good afternoon, class. This is my final paper and presentation for CMI 210. This is my last class before I finish my degree, so this is wrapping me up for the college experience altogether. So excited to have this one under my belt and moving on, and I'm sure you guys are all kind of in the same boat. So if you can see my screen here on my PowerPoint, I decided to do my final presentation on millennials, millennials in the church specifically, and how the church is going to be hopefully different as the millennials come into leadership roles in the next 5 to 10 years, say, coming into the church. So I believe that the church is going to probably look drastically different in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years as millennials begin to roll into main leadership roles in the church in general and different denominations in particular. So millennials and the church and leadership in the future. That's basically my paper and premise for the final paper. So my first slide title is basically who are millennials, a few facts about them. Millennials were born between 1981 and 1996. Many of them were defined partially by the 9/11 attacks when they were younger children. That's in their formative years as 9/11 happened. Also a few other things that defined them. There was wars in the Middle East and in Pakistan kind of wrapped around the whole 9/11 thing. So those were some of the defining things that were happening in their formative years as their childhoods. Another one was the Obama presidency. So there's, whether you're for that or against that, there's lots of things that happened there that are formative for them. Our first black president, Democratic president first in a while, that we'd had Republicans before that. And so there was a lot of things that happened in Obama's presidency, both good and bad, that were very formative to who millennials are in general. And then the next thing I have is came into the workforce during a recession. So I believe that's really, really important. Me being a Gen Xer, I came into the workforce in the mid to late 90s when the economy was really good. So there was no struggle to find a job. There was no recession. Everything was it was a boom economy. And so money was easily found, jobs were easily found. And so that's a completely different idea when you come out of college with debt and other things, is whether you have a boom economy or a recession economy. So one of the formative things for them is they're coming out of school in a recession and having to work harder to find jobs, and it's just a whole different context for them. According to Pew Research, 56% of millennials identify as Christian, and 36% also identify as nuns. And the nuns, you'll know, probably have basically classified themselves as no religious affiliation. So you can see the numbers are pretty high there. In that 56% that identify as Christians, that's who they self-identify as Christians. That wouldn't mean that the church would necessarily identify them as Christians, but that they self-identify as Christians. So that can be sometimes two different things. One of the other things is technology has drastically changed their lives. They feel more connected through technology, yet they are more relationally disconnected than ever. So socially they're very connected, but interpersonally they seem to be very disconnected. So those ideas, you could kind of think through your head, those ideas in going into the church scenario can drastically change the way things are done and the way things happen. So that's just a few things about millennials, a few facts and defining characteristics about them. The next slide is titled, How Do We Reach Them? Kind of the church reinvented is my idea here. The very first thing that I have is maintain their doctrinal and theological base. I think it's always important that each generation that comes along, we have an idea that we have to not cater our doctrine and theology to them, but make it relevant and relatable to them while still keeping it sound and truthful all at the same time. So that seems to be getting to more and more of a slippery slope as we go, is to make it relatable to them and real to them without watering it down. That's always a struggle when you're talking about the next generation and the gospel presentation to them. So, and then this was taken out of our first textbook that we had, enculturating them instead of them enculturating us. So this is very much the idea of the church as being the subculture in America anymore. kind of winning that battle of inculturating them with the EN, inculturating them with our doctrines and our theology and our Bible and our way of life, and not letting the society and the culture as a whole inculturate us with the IN, inculturation. So it's very much that idea of the battle and the struggle back and forth of who's winning the war kind of thing, as far as are they impressing on us or are we impressing on them? So the first thing I have is there's kind of a 3 steps. First is gospel demonstration. One of the things that millennials are very big on is show me attitude. And so they're willing to buy in and they're willing to believe, but you have to kind of build a bridge to them and kind of earn some ground with them. And so the first thing I have is gospel demonstration. We have to not only just preach at them, which is what I have for my second step, but the first step is we have to kind of earn their trust and build that relationship with them. And we can do that by demonstrating the gospel to them. So then when we get to the second phase, which is gospel proclamation, we have already kind of build up some goodwill in the relationship between us and them, and so they're much more willing to listen to the gospel proclamation if they see what we're saying we've already lived previous. So those things will start trying to connect for them. And then thirdly, the last thing, gospel inculturation. So now that we've built the bridge to them and we've kind of showed them that we live this gospel, and then we proclaim this to them, and so they kind of start to hear and know this gospel. And then the third thing is it'd be an inculturation, so they would hopefully buy in, and we could start inculturating them with our gospel way of life, rather than society inculturating them with their way of life. The last thing I have on here is what could this look like, and that probably would look very different from traditional church. I think there's going to be a huge rollover, a huge change in the way church is done. I believe most churches still are very traditional in the way that they do church, and I believe that's going to change. It has to change in order to start to attract millennials as they move into leadership roles, and then also the generation after millennials. Why do millennials matter? The millennials matter because they're the next generation that's going to come into leadership. The stakes are very high, and so what do? I believe that God has a heart and a plan for millennials. I believe that if you look at millennials, they're a totally different generation than my generation, the Gen Xers. And I believe that God has a plan for them to use them to change the church for the better in the next 10 to 15 years. The second thing I have is we join God in what He's already doing. I believe God has already got a plan for millennials, and I believe that plan's already in the process, that we have to see where we fit into that and step into that, and then sometimes step out of the way of that. So those are a few of the things that I have. The next thing is we have to pray. We have to pray to God to see what our part in that is. Whether that's helping them or whether that's getting out of the way for them. The next one is we have to help millennials use their special attributes. Millennials, due to the way that they've been formed and shaped in their childhoods and through their parenting and all of those things, have special talents and attributes that none of us have. And so I believe God has a use for those coming forward, that's part of how the church is going to look different and why the church is going to have to be different, is millennials are just set up differently than all past leadership generations that we've had before. So that's going to be an important part of it. I think we have to rethink and redesign the way the church is done. I don't think that we're going to attract good millennial leadership under the same constructs that we do church now. Baby boomers had their way of doing it. Gen Xers, which is my generation, are coming in and been for a while. They have a certain way of doing it. Millennials are going to have to do it differently. They're just a different generation than we've all been. They're more technology driven and all those things. So the church is going to have to be reinvented in a way that makes sense to them, that stays true to the gospel, but also is relatable to them in a way that they can use it and move it forward. And then the last thing I have is we have to remember it's God's church, not ours. I think we have a hard time sometimes letting go of the reins of the church. The baby boomers want it done a certain way. It's the way it's always been done. Unfortunately, all the numbers say that that's not really working. So as we go farther down the road, if we want to continue to lose millennials in the next generation, we can stick to the old tried and true that it's not really working anymore, or we can be willing to say, hey, this is God's church. What is He doing? What are we doing, and where can we be part of that? What needs to change, and what can we improve? So I think those are huge questions that we have to answer going forward. So for my conclusion, I have, could millennials be the generation that changes the church? I think if you look back to the original Acts church, and if you look back to the time of Jesus, when he picked his 12 disciples, those same disciples that he picked would be millennials of that time. They would be of the same age as what millennials are now. You know, when he picked Peter and Paul and Matthew and all those guys were probably all in their 20s and 30s at that time. They weren't the who's who of the time back then. They were just regular average old people, average old guys who were different occupations that he chose to use and walk with and to build his church with. So I think that same thing is true with millennials. I think they have a lot of attributes the same as what the original disciples did. That God is ready and willing and able to use those people. It's not always the most brilliant or the most skilled or the most knowledgeable that he used. Usually it's the exact opposite. Millennials kind of get a bad rap for a lot of things, but I think God is on the cusp of getting ready to do something great with that generation, stepping them into leadership and changing the church going into the future. So that's my presentation. Thank you for the class. I thank you for my time at Spring Arbor, and I hope you all have a great Christmas. Good luck and God bless.